When school let out, the two of us went to my backyard to fight. We were trying to make each other tougher. So in the grass, in the shade of the pines and junipers, Gordon and I slung off our backpacks and laid down a pale green garden hose tip to tip, making a ring. Then we stripped off our shirts and put on our gold-colored boxing gloves and fought. Every round went 2 minutes. If you stepped out of the ring, you lost. If you cried, you lost. If you got knocked out or if you yelled stop, you lost. Afterwards, we drank Coca-Colas and smoked Marlboros, our chests heaving, our faces all different shades of blacks and reds and yellows. We began fighting after Seth Johnson, a no-neck linebacker with teeth like corn kernels and hands like T-bone steaks, beat Gordon until his face swelled and split open and purpled around the edges. Eventually, he healed, the rough husks of scabs peeling away to reveal a different face than the one I remembered. Older, squarer, fiercer, his left eyebrow separated by a gummy white scar. It was his idea that we should fight each other. He wanted to be ready. He wanted to hurt those who hurt him, and if he went down, he would go down swinging as he was sure his father would. This is what we all wanted, to please our fathers, to make them proud, even though they had left us. This was in Crow, Oregon, a high desert town in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. In Crow, we have 1,500 people, a Dairy Queen, a BP gas station, a Food for Less, a meatpacking plant, a bright green football field irrigated by canal water, and your standard assortment of taverns and churches. Nothing distinguishes us from Bend, or Redmond, or Lapine, or any of the other nowhere towns off Route 97 except for this. We are home to the 2nd Battalion, 34th Marines. The Marines live on a 50-acre base in the hills just outside of town, a collection of one-story cinder-block buildings interrupted by cheatgrass and sagebrush. Throughout my childhood, I could hear, if I cupped a hand to my ear, the lowing of bulls, the bleating of sheep, and the report of assault rifles shouting from the hilltops. It's said that conditions here in Oregon's ranch country closely match the mountainous terrain of Afghanistan and northern Iraq. Our fathers, Gordon's and mine, were like the other fathers in Crow. All of them, just about, had enlisted as part-time soldiers, as reservists for drill pay, several thousand a year for a private and several thousand more for a sergeant. Beer pay, they called it. And for 2 weeks every year, plus 1 weekend a month, they trained. They threw on their camis and filled their rucksacks and kissed us goodbye, and the gates of the 2nd Battalion drew closed behind them. Our fathers would vanish into the pine-studded hills, returning to us Sunday night with their faces reddened from weather, their biceps trembling from fatigue, and their hands smelling of rifle grease. They would talk about ECPs and PRPs and MEUs and WMDs, and they would do push-ups in the middle of the living room, and they would call 6 o'clock 1800 hours, and they would high-five and yell Semper Fi. And then a few days would pass, and they would go back to the way they were, to the men we knew, Coors drinking, baseball throwing, crotch scratching, aqua velvet smelling fathers. No longer. In January, the battalion was activated, and in March, they shipped off for Iraq. Our fathers, our coaches, our teachers, our barbers, our cooks, our gas station attendants, and UPS delivery men and deputies and firemen and mechanics, our fathers, so many of them, climbed onto the olive green school buses and pressed their palms to the windows and gave us the bravest, most hopeful smiles you can imagine, and vanished, just like that. Nights, I sometimes got on my Honda dirt bike and rode through the hills and canyons of Deschutes County. Beneath me, the engine growled and shuddered, while all around me, the wind, like something alive, bullied me, tried to drag me from my bike. A dark world slipped past as I downshifted, leaning into a turn, and accelerated on a straightaway, my speed 70, then 80, concentrating only on the 20 yards of road glowing ahead of me. On this bike, I could ride and ride and ride, away from here, up and over the Cascades, through the Willamette Valley, until I reached the ocean, where the broad black backs of whales regularly broke the surface of the water, and even further, further still, until I caught up with the horizon, where my father would be waiting. Inevitably, I ended up at Hole in the Ground. A long time ago, a meteor came screeching down from space and left behind a crater 5,000 feet wide and 300 feet deep. Hole in the Ground is frequented during the winter by the daredevil sledders among us, and during the summer by bearded geologists interested in the metal fragments strewn across its bottom. I dangled my feet over the edge of the crater and leaned back on my elbows and took in the black sky. No moon, only stars, just a little lighter than a raven. Every few minutes a star seemed to come unstuck, streaking through the night in a bright flash that burned into nothingness. In the near distance, Crow glowed grayish-green against the darkness, a reminder of how close to oblivion we lived. A chunk of space ice or a solar wind could have jogged the meteor sideways, and rather than landing here, it could have landed there, at the intersection of Maine and Farwell. No Dairy Queen, no Crow High, no 2nd Battalion. It didn't take much imagination to realize how something can drop out of the sky and change everything. This was in October, when Gordon and I circled each other in the backyard after school. We wore our golden boxing gloves, cracked with age and flaking when we pounded them together. Browned grass crunched beneath our sneakers, and dust rose in little puffs like distress signals. Gordon was thin to the point of being scrawny. His collarbone poked against his skin like a swallowed coat hanger. His head was too big for his body, and his eyes were too big for his head, and football players, Seth Johnson among them, regularly tossed him into garbage cans and called him E.T. He had had a bad day, and I could tell from the look on his face, the watery eyes, the trembling lips that revealed in quick flashes his buck teeth, that he needed to hit me. So I let him. I raised my gloves to my face and pulled my elbows against my ribs, and Gordon lunged forward, his arms snapping like rubber bands. I stood still, allowing his fists to work up and down my body, allowing him to throw the weight of his anger on me, until eventually he grew too tired to hit anymore, and I opened up my stance and floored him with a right cross to the temple. He lay there sprawled out in the grass with a smile on his E.T. face. "Damn," he said in a dreamy voice. A drop of blood gathered along the corner of his eye and streaked down his temple into his hair. My father wore steel-toed boots, Carhartt jeans, and a t-shirt advertising some place he had traveled, maybe Yellowstone or Seattle. He looked like someone you might see shopping for motor oil at Bi-Mart. To hide his receding hairline, he wore a John Deere cap that laid a shadow across his face. His brown eyes blinked above a considerable nose underlined by a gray mustache. Like me, my father was short and squat, a bulldog. And his belly was a swollen bag, and his shoulders were broad, good for carrying me during parades and at fairs when I was younger. He laughed a lot. He liked game shows. He drank too much beer and smoked too many cigarettes and spent too much time with his buddies, fishing, hunting, bullshitting, which probably had something to do with why my mother divorced him and moved to Boise with a hairdresser and triathlete named Chuck. At first, after my father left, like all of the other fathers, he would email whenever he could. He would tell me about the heat, the gallons of water he drank every day, the sand that got into everything, the baths he took with baby wipes. He would tell me how safe he was, how very safe. This was when he was stationed in Turkey. Then the reservists shipped for Kirkuk, where insurgents and sandstorms attacked almost daily. The emails came less frequently. Weeks of silence passed between them. Sometimes on the computer, I would hit refresh, 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 hoping. In October, I received an email that read, "Hi, Josh, I'm okay. Don't worry. Do your homework. Love, Dad." I printed it up and hung it on my door with a piece of Scotch tape. For 20 years, my father worked at Nosler Inc., the bullet manufacturer based out of Bend, and the Marines trained him as an ammunition technician. Gordon liked to say his father was a gunnery sergeant, and he was, but we all knew he was also the battalion mess manager, a cook, which was how he made his living in Crow, tending the grill at Hamburger Patties. We knew their titles, but we didn't know, not really, what their titles meant, what our fathers did over there. We imagined them doing heroic things, rescuing Iraqi babies from burning huts, sniping suicide bombers just before they could detonate on a crowded city street. We drew on Hollywood and TV news to develop elaborate scenarios where maybe, at twilight during a trek through the mountains of northern Iraq, bearded insurgents ambushed our fathers with rocket launchers. We imagined them silhouetted by a fiery explosion. We imagined them burrowing into the sand like lizards and firing their M16s, their bullets streaking through the darkness like the meteorites I observed on sleepless nights. When Gordon and I fought, we painted our faces, black and green and brown, with the camo grease our fathers left behind. It made our eyes and teeth appear startlingly white, and it smeared away against our gloves just as the grass smeared away beneath our sneakers. And the ring became a circle of dirt, the dirt a reddish color that looked a lot like scabbed flesh. One time, Gordon hammered my shoulder so hard I couldn't lift my arm for a week. Another time, I elbowed one of his kidneys and he peed blood. We struck each other with such force and frequency, the golden gloves crumbled and our knuckles showed through the sweat-soaked, blood-soaked foam like teeth through a busted lip. So we bought another set of gloves, and as the air grew steadily colder, we fought with steam blasting from our mouths. Our fathers had left us, but men remained in Crow. There were old men, like my grandfather, whom I lived with, men who had paid their dues, who had worked their jobs and fought their wars, and now spent their days at the gas station drinking bad coffee from styrofoam cups, complaining about the weather, arguing about the best months to reap alfalfa. And there were incapable men, men who rarely shaved and watched daytime television in their once white underpants, men who lived in trailers and filled their shopping carts with Busch Light, summer sausage, Oreo cookies. And then there were vulturous men, like Dave Lightner, men who scavenged whatever our fathers had left behind. Dave Lightner worked as a recruitment officer. I'm guessing he was the only recruitment officer in world history who drove a Vespa scooter with a Support Our Troops ribbon magnet on its rear. We sometimes saw it parked outside the homes of young women whose husbands had gone to war. Dave had big ears and small eyes and wore his hair in your standard issue high and tight buzz. He often spoke in a too loud voice about all the insurgents he gunned down when working a Fallujah patrol unit. He lived with his mother in Crow, but spent his days in Bend and Redmond, trolling the parking lots of Best Buy, Shopko, Kmart, Walmart, Mountain View Mall. He was looking for people like us. People who were angry and dissatisfied and poor. But Dave Lightner knew better than to bother us. On duty, he stayed away from Crow entirely. Recruiting there would be too much like poaching the burned section of a forest where deer, rib-slatted and wobbly-legged, nosed through the ash, seeking something green. We didn't fully understand the reason our fathers were fighting. We only understood that they had to fight. The necessity of it made the reason irrelevant. "It's all part of the game," my grandfather said. "It's just the way it is." We could only cross our fingers and wish on stars and hit refresh, refresh, hoping they would return to us, praying we would never find Dave Lightner on our porch uttering the words, "I regret to inform you." One time my grandfather dropped Gordon and me off at Mountain View Mall, and there, near the glass-doored entrance, stood Dave Lightner. He wore his creased khaki uniform and spoke with a group of Mexican teenagers. They were laughing, shaking their heads, and walking away from him as we approached. We had our hats pulled low, and he didn't recognize us. "A question for you, gentlemen," he said in the voice of telemarketers and door-to-door Jehovah's Witnesses. "What do you plan on doing with your lives?" Gordon pulled off his hat with a flourish, as if he were part of some ta-da magic act and his face was the trick. "I plan on killing some crazy-ass Muslims," he said and forced a smile. "How about you, Josh?" "Yeah," I said. "Kill some people, then get myself killed." I grimaced even as I played along. "That sounds like a good plan." Dave Lightner's lips tightened into a thin line, his posture straightened, and he asked us what we thought our fathers would think hearing us right now. "They're out there risking their lives, defending our freedom, and you're cracking sick jokes," he said. "I think that's sick." We hated him for his soft hands and clean uniform. We hated him because he sent people like us off to die. Because at 23, he had attained a higher rank than our fathers. Because he slept with the lonely wives of soldiers. And now we hated him even more for making us feel ashamed. I wanted to say something sarcastic, but Gordon was quicker. His hand was out before him, his fingers gripping an imaginary bottle. "Here's your maple syrup," he said. Dave said, "And what is that for?" "To eat my ass with," Gordon said. Right then a skateboarder type with green hair and a nose ring walked from the mall, a bag full of DVDs swinging from his fist, and Dave Lightner forgot us. "Hey, friend," he was saying, "let me ask you something. Do you like war movies?" In November, we drove our dirt bikes deep into the woods to hunt. Sunlight fell through tall pines and birch clusters and lay in puddles along the logging roads that wound past the hillsides packed with huckleberries and on the moraines where coyotes scurried, trying to flee from us and slipping, causing tiny avalanches of loose rock. It hadn't rained in nearly a month, so the crabgrass and the cheatgrass and the pine needles had lost their color, dry and blonde as corn husks, crackling beneath my boots when the road we followed petered out into nothing and I stepped off my bike. In this waterless stillness, it seemed you could hear every chipmunk within a square acre rustling for pine nuts, and when the breeze rose into a cold wind, the forest became a giant whisper. We dumped our tent and our sleeping bags near a basalt grotto with a spring bubbling from it, and Gordon said, "Let's go, troops," holding his rifle before his chest diagonally as a soldier would. He dressed as a soldier would too, wearing his father's overlarge camis rather than the mandatory blaze orange gear. 50 feet apart, we worked our way downhill through the forest, through a huckleberry thicket, through a clear cut crowded with stumps, taking care not to make much noise or slip on the pine needles carpeting the ground. A chipmunk worrying at a pine cone screeched its astonishment when a peregrine falcon swooped down and seized it, carrying it off between the trees to some secret place. Its wings made no sound, and neither did the blaze-orange-clad hunter when he appeared in a clearing several hundred yards below us. Gordon made some sort of SWAT team gesture meant, I think, to say stay low, and I made my way carefully toward him. From behind a boulder, we peered through our scopes, tracking the hunter, who looked in his vest and ear-flapped hat like a monstrous pumpkin. "That cocksucker," Gordon said in a harsh whisper. The hunter was Seth Johnson. His rifle was strapped to his back and his mouth was moving. He was talking to someone. At the corner of the meadow, he joined 4 members of the varsity football squad who sat on logs around a smoldering campfire, their arms bobbing like oil pump jacks as they brought their beers to their mouths. I took my eye from my scope and noticed Gordon fingering the trigger of his .30-06. I told him to quit fooling around, and he pulled his hand suddenly away from the stock and smiled guiltily, and said he just wanted to know what it felt like having that power over someone. Then his trigger finger rose up and touched the gummy white scar that split his eyebrow. "I say, we fuck with them a little." I shook my head no. Gordon said, "Just a little to scare them." "They've got guns," I said, and he said, "So, we'll come back tonight." Later, after an early dinner of beef jerky and trail mix and Gatorade, I happened upon a 4-point stag nibbling on some bear grass, and I rested my rifle on a stump and shot it, and it stumbled backwards and collapsed with a rose blooming from behind its shoulder where the heart was hidden. Gordon came running, and we stood around the deer and smoked a few cigarettes, watching the thick arterial blood run from its mouth. Then we took out our knives and got to work. I cut around the anus, cutting away the penis and testes, and then ran the knife along the belly, unzipping the hide to reveal the delicate pink flesh and greenish vessels into which our hands disappeared. The blood steamed in the cold mountain air, and when we finished, when we'd skinned the deer and hacked at its joints and cut out its back strap and boned out its shoulders and hips, its neck and ribs, making chops, roasts, steaks, quartering the meat so we could bundle it into our insulated saddlebags, Gordon picked up the deer head by the antlers and held it before his own. Blood from its neck made a pattering sound on the ground, and in the half-light of early evening, Gordon began to do a little dance, bending his knees and stomping his feet. "I think I've got an idea," he said, and pretended to charge at me with the antlers. I pushed him away, and he said, "Don't pussy out on me, Josh." I was exhausted and reeked of gore, but I could appreciate the need for revenge. "Just to scare them, right, Gordo?" I said. "Right." We lugged our meat back to camp, and Gordon brought the deer hide. He slit a hole in its middle and poked his head through so the hide hung off him loosely, a hairy sack, and I helped him smear mud and blood across his face. Then, with his Leatherman, he sawed off the antlers and held them in each hand and slashed at the air as if they were claws. Night had come on, and the moon hung over the Cascades, grayly lighting our way as we crept through the forest, imagining ourselves in enemy territory, with trip wires and guard dogs and towers around every corner. From behind the boulder that overlooked their campsite, we observed our enemies as they swapped hunting stories and joked about Jessica Robertson's big-ass titties, and passed around a bottle of whiskey and drank to excess and finally pissed on the fire to extinguish it. When they retired to their tents, we waited an hour before making our way down the hill with such care that it took us another hour before we were upon them. Somewhere an owl hooted, its noise barely noticeable over the chorus of snores that rose up from their tents. Seth's Bronco was parked nearby. The license plate read S-Man, and all their rifles lay in its cab. I collected the guns, slinging them over my shoulder, Then I eased my knife into each of Seth's tires. I still had my knife out when we were standing beside Seth's tent, and when a cloud scudded over the moon and made the meadow fully dark, I stabbed the nylon and in one quick jerk opened up a slit. Gordon rushed in, his antler claws slashing. I could see nothing but shadows, but I could hear Seth scream the scream of a little girl as Gordon raked at him with the antlers and hissed and howled like some cave creature hungry for man flesh. When the tents around us came alive with confused voices, Gordon reemerged with a horrible smile on his face, and I followed him up the hillside, crashing through the undergrowth, leaving Seth to make sense of the nightmare that had descended upon him without warning. Winter came. Snow fell, and we threw on our coveralls and wrenched on our studded tires and drove our dirt bikes to Hole in the Ground, dragging our sleds behind us with tow ropes. Our engines filled the white silence of the afternoon. Our back tires kicked up plumes of powder and on sharp turns slipped out beneath us, and we lay there in the middle of the road, bleeding, laughing, unafraid. Earlier for lunch, we had cooked a pound of bacon with a stick of butter. The grease, which hardened into a white, waxy pool, we used as polish, buffing it into the bottoms of our sleds. Speed was what we wanted at Hole in the Ground. We descended the steepest section of the crater into its heart, 300 feet below us. We followed each other in the same track, ironing down the snow to create a chute, blue-hued and frictionless, that would allow us to travel at a speed equivalent to free fall. Our eyeballs glazed with frost, our ears roared with wind, and our stomachs rose into our throats as we rocketed down and felt like we were 5 again. And then we began the slow climb back the way we came and felt 50. We wore crampons and ascended in a zigzagging series of switchbacks. It took nearly an hour. The air had begun to go purple with evening when we stood again at the lip of the crater, sweating in our coveralls, taking in the view through the fog of our breath. Gordon packed a snowball. I said, "You better not hit me with that." He cocked his arm threateningly and smiled, then dropped to his knees to roll the snowball into something bigger. He rolled it until it grew to the size of a large man curled into the fetal position. From the back of his bike, he took the piece of garden hose he used to siphon gas from fancy foreign cars and worked it into his tank, sucking at its end until gas flowed. He doused the giant snowball as if he hoped it would sprout. It didn't melt. He'd packed it tight enough, but it puckered slightly and appeared leaden. And when Gordon withdrew his Zippo, sparked it, and held it toward the ball, the fumes caught flame, and the whole thing erupted with a gasping noise that sent me staggering back a few steps. Gordon rushed forward and kicked the ball of fire, sending it rolling, tumbling down the crater, down our chute like a meteor, and the snow beneath it instantly melted, only to freeze again a moment later, making a slick blue ribbon. When we sledded it, we went so fast, our minds emptied, and we felt a sensation at once, like flying and falling. On the news, Iraqi insurgents fired their assault rifles. On the news, a car bomb in Baghdad blew up 7 American soldiers at a traffic checkpoint. On the news, the president said he did not think it was wise to provide a time frame for troop withdrawal. I checked my email before breakfast and found nothing but spam. Gordon and I fought in the snow wearing snow boots. We fought so much our wounds never got a chance to heal, and our faces took on a permanent look of decay. Our wrists felt swollen, our knees ached, our joints felt full of tiny dry wasps. We fought until fighting hurt too much, and we took up drinking instead. Weekends we drove our dirt bikes to Bend, 20 miles away, and bought beer, and took it to Hole in the Ground, and drank there until a bright line of sunlight appeared on the horizon and illuminated the snow-blanketed desert. Nobody asked for our IDs. And when we held up our empty bottles and stared at our reflections in the glass, warped and ghostly, we knew why. And we weren't alone. Black bags grew beneath the eyes of the sons and daughters and wives of Crow, their shoulders stooped, wrinkles enclosing their mouths like parentheses. Our fathers haunted us. They were everywhere. In the grocery store when we spotted a 30-pack of Coors on sale for $10. On the highway when we passed a jacked-up Dodge with a dozen hay bales stacked in its bed. In the sky when a jet roared by, reminding us of faraway places. And now, as our bodies thickened with muscle, as we stopped shaving and grew patchy beards, we saw our fathers even in the mirror. We began to look like them. Our fathers who had been taken from us were everywhere, at every turn, imprisoning us. Seth Johnson's father was a staff sergeant. Like his son, he was a big man, but not big enough. Just before Christmas, he stepped on a cluster bomb. A U.S. warplane dropped it, and the sand camouflaged it, and he stepped on it, and it tore him into many meaty pieces. When Dave Leitner climbed up the front porch with a black armband and a somber expression, Mrs. Johnson, who was cooking a honeyed ham at the time, collapsed on the kitchen floor. Seth pushed his way out the door and punched Dave in the face, breaking his nose before he could utter the words, "I regret to inform you." Hearing about this, we felt bad for all of 10 seconds. Then we felt good, because it was his father and not ours. And then we felt bad again. And on Christmas Eve, we drove to Seth's house and laid down on his porch the rifles we had stolen, along with a 6-pack of Coors. And then just as we were about to leave, Gordon dug in his back pocket and removed his wallet and placed under the 6-pack all the money he had. A few 5s, some 1s. "Fucking Christmas," he said. We got braver and went to the bars. The Golden Nugget, the Weary Traveler, the Pine Tavern, where we square danced with older women wearing purple eyeshadow and sparkly dreamcatcher earrings and push-up bras and clattery high heels. We told them we were Marines back from a 6-month deployment, and they said, "Really?" And we said, "Yes, ma'am." And when they asked for our names, we gave them the names of our fathers. Then we bought them drinks, and they drank them in a gulping way and breathed hotly in our faces, and we brought our mouths against theirs, and they tasted like menthol cigarettes, like burnt detergent. And then we went home with them, to their trailers, to their water beds, where among the stuffed animals, we fucked them. Mid-afternoon, and it was already full dark. On our way to the Weary Traveler, we stopped by my house to bum some money off my grandfather, only to find Dave Leitner waiting for us. He must have just gotten there. He was halfway up the porch steps when our headlights cast an anemic glow over him, and he turned to face us with a scrunched-up expression as if trying to figure out who we were. He wore the black band around his arm, and over his nose a white bandaged splint. We did not turn off our engines. Instead, we sat in the driveway, idling, the exhaust from our bikes and the breath from our mouths clouding the air. Above us, a star hissed across the moonlit sky, vaguely bright, like a light turned on in a daylit room. Then Dave began down the steps, and we leapt off our bikes to meet him. Before he could speak, I brought my fist to his diaphragm, knocking the breath from his body. He looked like a gunshot actor in a western, clutching his belly with both hands, doubled over, his face making a nice target for Gordon's knee. A snap sound preceded Dave falling on his back with blood coming from his already broken nose. He put up his hands, and we hit our way through them. I punched him once, twice in the ribs, while Gordon kicked him in the spine and the stomach, and then we stood around gulping air and allowed him to struggle to his feet. When he righted himself, he wiped his face with his hand and blood dripped from his fingers. I moved in and roundhoused with my right, then my left, my fists knocking his head loose on its hinges. Again he collapsed, a bloody bag of a man. His eyes walled and turned up, trying to see the animal bodies looming over him. He opened his mouth to speak, and I pointed a finger at him and said with enough hatred in my voice to break a back, "Don't say a word. Don't you dare. Not one word." He closed his mouth and tried to crawl away, and I brought a boot down on the back of his skull and left it there a moment, grinding his face into the ground so that when he lifted his head, the snow held a red impression of his face. Gordon went inside and returned a moment later with a roll of duct tape, and we held Dave down and bound his wrists and ankles and threw him on a sled and taped him to it many times over, and then tied the sled to the back of Gordon's bike and drove at a perilous speed to Hole in the Ground. The moon shone down, and the snow glowed with pale blue light as we smoked cigarettes, looking down into the crater with Dave at our feet. There was something childish about the way our breath puffed from our mouths in tiny clouds. It was as if we were imitating choo-choo trains. And for a moment, just a moment, we were kids again. Just a couple of stupid kids. Gordon must have felt this too, because he said, "My mom wouldn't even let me play with toy guns when I was little." And he sighed heavily, as if he couldn't understand how we had ended up here. Then with a sudden lurch, Dave began struggling and yelling at us in a slurred voice, and my face hardened with anger, and I put my hands on him and pushed him slowly to the lip of the crater, and he grew silent. For a moment, I forgot myself, staring off into the dark oblivion. It was beautiful and horrifying. "I could shove you right now," I said. "And if I did, you'd be dead." "Oh, please don't," he said, his voice cracking. He began to cry. "Oh, fuck, don't, please." Hearing his great shuddering sobs didn't bring me the satisfaction I had hoped for. If anything, I felt as I did that day so long ago when we taunted him in the Mountain View Mall parking lot. Shameful. False. "Ready?" I said. 1. I inched him a little closer to the edge. 2. I moved him a little closer still, and as I did, I felt unwieldy, at once wild and exhausted, my body seeming to take on another 20, 30, 40 years. When I finally said 3, my voice was barely a whisper. We left Dave there, sobbing at the brink of the crater. We got on our bikes and we drove to Bend, and we drove so fast. I imagined catching fire like a meteor, burning up in a flash, howling as my heat consumed me as we made our way to the U.S. Marine Recruiting Office, where we would at last answer the fierce alarm of war and put our pens to paper and make our fathers proud.